In the final months of World War II, Allied troops advancing into Germany stumbled upon something that seemed less like a weapon of war and more like a machine from the future. Hidden in forest bunkers, underground tunnels, and wrecked rail cars were sleek metal cylinders more than 45 feet long, their surfaces blackened by soot and frost. At first, many soldiers thought they had found parts of an experimental aircraft or some kind of jet-propelled artillery. They were wrong. These were the remnants of Germany's Vergeltungswaffe 2, the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. Unlike the V-1 flying bomb, which used a pulse jet engine and could be intercepted, the V-2 flew at supersonic speed, climbing nearly 100 kilometers into the edge of space before plunging back to Earth at over 3,500 miles per hour. There was no warning, no defense. When a V-2 hit, its victims never heard it coming. Between 1944 and 1945, the Nazi regime had launched more than 3,000 V-2s, striking London, Antwerp, and Liège. Each carried a 1-ton warhead of high explosive, killing thousands of civilians. But while the rockets were terror weapons in practice, their engineering represented something entirely new, a step beyond anything the Allies possessed. When the first intact V-2 components were recovered in the spring of 1945, American and British scientists were stunned. The rocket's liquid fuel engine, gyroscopic guidance, and aerodynamic control vanes were the result of a research effort years ahead of any Allied program. To most US scientists, the V-2 was not a weapon. It was a manifestation of science fiction made real. In May 1945, US Army intelligence teams reached the heart of the German rocket program. The vast underground Mittelwerk factory near Nordhausen, where tens of thousands of prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp had been forced to assemble rockets by hand. The sight shocked the soldiers. Rows of half-finished V-2s lay in the tunnels, surrounded by the bodies of labourers who had died under brutal conditions. Among the ruins, army engineers found documents stamped Peenemünde, the Baltic island where Wernher von Braun and his team had developed the rockets under the Heeresversuchsanstalt Peenemünde Research Centre. Von Braun and many of his colleagues had already fled south, seeking to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. The US quickly realized that what they had discovered was more than wreckage. It was the foundation of a new kind of warfare. In the United States, rocket research before 1945 had been limited to experimental programs led by visionaries like Dr. Robert H. Goddard and small army tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The V-2 dwarfed anything America had built. It was 14 meters tall, weighed 12 tons, and used a mixture of liquid oxygen and alcohol fuel, feeding a combustion chamber capable of producing 55,000 pounds of thrust. Its internal guidance, based on gyroscopes and analog computers, allowed it to fly autonomously hundreds of kilometers. When fragments of the first captured rocket were shipped to London for analysis, British scientist Sir Geoffrey Taylor reportedly remarked, "This is not an artillery shell. This is the birth of spaceflight." American scientists agreed. The V-2 represented the future of both war and exploration, a technology capable of delivering payloads across continents or one day into orbit. Within weeks, the US Army Ordnance Corps launched a secret mission to secure every piece of the V-2 program they could find. The code name was Operation Lusty, later followed by Operation Paperclip. The orders were clear: capture the rockets, capture the scientists, and capture the future before the Soviets did. By June 1945, trainloads of V-2 components, technical manuals, and surviving German engineers were already on their way to Antwerp and then across the Atlantic. The US had won the race to seize the technology, but not yet the understanding. That would come later, in the deserts of New Mexico, where American scientists finally saw the V-2 come to life, and realized just how far behind they truly were. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended, but for American scientists, a new kind of campaign was just beginning. Trainloads of dismantled German V-2 rockets and crates of technical documents were arriving at White Sands Proving Ground in the deserts of New Mexico. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department had chosen the site for its isolation and open space. It was the only place vast enough to launch something that could fly into the stratosphere and come down hundreds of miles away. What had been discovered in Germany was astonishing but incomplete. None of the captured V-2s were intact, and only a handful of the German engineers truly understood how to assemble and calibrate the systems. The Americans had the blueprints, but not the practical experience. They could read how the rocket worked, yet they didn't understand why it worked so well. To bridge that gap, the Army authorized Operation Paperclip, a classified program to bring selected German scientists to the United States. Among them were Wernher von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and dozens of Peenemunde's engineers, mechanics, and draftsmen. Many had already surrendered voluntarily, preferring to work for the Americans than risk Soviet captivity. They arrived quietly at Fort Bliss, Texas, in late 1945 under military supervision. At White Sands, the desert base was little more than a handful of wooden hangars, wind-measuring towers, and scorched sand. The Americans had never launched a rocket larger than a few meters tall. Now they faced the task of assembling a machine weighing 12 tons and standing nearly 14 meters high. The first challenge was simply understanding the parts. The fuel system alone consisted of more than 5,000 separate components: pumps, valves, regulators, and cables. Each line had to be cleaned, aligned, and pressure tested. Working side by side, US technicians and German specialists spent months reassembling the first test rocket. They painted an American star on its fuselage but kept the original German numbering. The liquid fuel tanks were filled with a mix of alcohol and liquid oxygen, both hazardous and unfamiliar to most of the American ground crews. At ignition, the rocket's main engine would reach temperatures high enough to melt steel if the cooling system failed. On April 16, 1946, after nearly a year of preparation, the first fully assembled V-2 stood upright on Launch Pad 33. Observers from the Army, Navy, and newly formed RAND Corporation gathered behind sand-bagged shelters 2 miles away. The countdown was handled in both English and German. At 0, the engine ignited with a deafening roar. A column of orange flame engulfed the pad as the rocket rose slowly, then accelerated skyward. For a few seconds, it seemed to hang motionless. Then it shot upward faster than anything the Americans had ever seen, disappearing into a clear blue sky at over 3,000 miles per hour. The launch was only partially successful. The rocket broke apart on re-entry and crashed more than 100 miles away. But the message was unmistakable. The United States had just launched the first ballistic missile on American soil, a captured German weapon now flying under a new flag. The scientists at White Sands were both exhilarated and humbled. The telemetry data showed performance they had never achieved with their own experimental designs. The V-2's engine reached thrust levels 5 times greater than any US rocket. Its guidance system, a combination of gyroscopes and an analog autopilot, maintained stability through an intricate dance of servos and vanes. Dr. Robert H. Goddard's pioneering work in the 1920s had proved that liquid fuel rockets were possible, but America had never funded his projects beyond the prototype stage. The Germans, by contrast, had poured vast state resources into turning theory into production. They had industrialized what the Allies had only theorized. As more launches followed through 1946 and 1947, American engineers began to appreciate the scope of what they were seeing. Each test taught them new lessons about combustion dynamics, supersonic flight, and heat shielding. Scientists from the newly created Jet Propulsion Laboratory and Naval Research Laboratory came to observe, taking notes that would feed into their own programs. One White Sands engineer later recalled, "We weren't just testing a weapon, we were reading a textbook written in another language. Every bolt and circuit told us how far ahead they'd been." By the end of 1947, the United States had successfully launched 67 V-2 rockets from White Sands. Most reached altitudes between 60 and 110 miles, carrying cameras and instruments that photographed the curvature of the Earth for the first time in human history. But the deeper lesson ran through every report sent back to Washington. The Germans had achieved in 4 years what it might take the Americans a decade to replicate. The V-2 wasn't just the world's first ballistic missile, it was the dawn of the space age. And for the US scientists standing in that desert, watching those black and white rockets vanish into the heavens, the realization was sobering. They were no longer measuring victory by battlefields or bombs, but by altitude and velocity. The war was over. The race for the future had just begun. By 1947, it was no longer about who had won the war. It was about who would control the future. The V-2 had shown that humanity could reach the edge of space, and both East and West knew that whoever mastered that technology would dominate the next century. In the deserts of New Mexico, American engineers and German specialists were launching captured rockets almost weekly, while across the Iron Curtain, Soviet scientists were doing the same with V-2s recovered from Peenemünde and Nordhausen. The same weapon that had terrorized Europe was now fueling a silent arms race between former allies. The US Army Ordnance Department quickly realized it needed more than borrowed technology. It needed the minds that built it. That meant turning Operation Paperclip, initially a small intelligence effort, into a full-scale recruitment drive. Over 120 of Germany's top rocket scientists, engineers and technicians were quietly moved from occupied zones into American custody. They were housed first at Fort Bliss, Texas, and then relocated to Huntsville, Alabama, where the US Army established the Redstone Arsenal. There, under the supervision of Major General Holger Toftoy, the Americans began building an indigenous missile program, with the German team at its core. At the center of it all was Dr. Wernher von Braun, the tall, charismatic engineer who had led design at Peenemünde. He was only 33 years old when he surrendered to the US Army. His technical mastery, combined with fluent English and a carefully apolitical charm, made him invaluable. Von Braun's team had not just built rockets, they had built an entire industrial ecosystem. Wind tunnels, telemetry labs, and production chains that connected science to engineering with military precision. Many in Washington were uneasy. These were former officers of the Nazi war machine, men who had built weapons under the SS and used forced labor from concentration camps. Yet the strategic stakes were too high. The Soviets were already scouring eastern Germany, capturing scientists and shipping them to Kaliningrad and Moscow. In the early days of the Cold War, morality took a back seat to national security. In 1948, as tensions grew in Europe, the American V-2 project formally became part of the Army's Guided Missile Division. Von Braun's group at Redstone began modifying the V-2 design into new models, the A-4B, Hermes, and Bumper rockets. These early hybrids combined German propulsion systems with American-built guidance and airframes. On February 24, 1949, a two-stage Bumper rocket lifted off from White Sands, a V-2 first stage carrying a small American-built W-AC Corporal second stage. It reached 250 miles, 400 kilometers, in altitude, higher than any man-made object had ever flown. For a brief moment, the black void above the blue sky no longer belonged to science fiction. The Army declared it a triumph of American ingenuity, but everyone involved knew the truth. The backbone of the rocket, its engine and structure, was still German. The V-2 program became the seed of the entire US missile industry. The Redstone, Jupiter, and Atlas ballistic missiles that followed all descended from its core engineering principles: liquid fuel, gyroscopic stabilization, and modular construction. The same equations written at Peenemünde now appeared in American manuals stamped top secret. Yet even as the Americans made progress, reports from Europe confirmed that the Soviets were moving just as fast. Their scientists, led by Sergei Korolev, had captured several V-2s from Polish rail depots and were conducting launches from a new facility at Kapustin Yar. They had also obtained captured German engineers, including Helmut Grötrup, a former member of von Braun's team. By 1950, both sides could build functional V-2 copies from scratch. The difference lay in ambition. Von Braun dreamed of space. The Soviets dreamed of proving socialism's superiority. And both nations wanted the ultimate weapon, a missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead across continents. At White Sands, the mood among American scientists was conflicted. Every launch brought new data, but also a reminder of dependence. The engineers knew they were still walking in Germany's shadow. American-built turbopumps still couldn't match the reliability of the captured ones, and few understood the full chemistry of the fuel systems. The Germans' experience came from hundreds of wartime launches. The Americans were still students. Dr. Richard Porter, one of the civilian scientists attached to the program, summed it up bluntly. "We won the war by numbers and production. They lost the war, but they had already built the future." By 1951, as the Cold War hardened, the US government began classifying much of the paperclip data. Many of the German scientists were granted citizenship and quietly absorbed into the American defense establishment. Huntsville's Redstone Arsenal became a closed city, its fences lined with armed guards and warning signs. Inside, a new rocket, the Redstone, was taking shape. It would be America's first operational medium-range ballistic missile, capable of delivering a nuclear warhead more than 200 miles. And its engine was a direct descendant of the V-2s. What began in the ruins of Peenemünde was now reborn in the heart of Alabama. But even as they tested new rockets, American engineers knew they were no longer just catching up with the past. They were competing against a mirror image of themselves in the Soviet Union. The race for the future had begun, and this time it would be measured not in years or miles, but in seconds and altitude. By the mid-1950s, the captured V-2 rocket had gone from being a Nazi terror weapon to the foundation stone of an entirely new industry. What had started in the tunnels of Mittelwerk now stretched from White Sands to Cape Canaveral, and from Peenemunde's ruins to the laboratories of Redstone Arsenal. The technology that once delivered destruction was being reshaped to reach the stars. Under Wernher von Braun's leadership, the Redstone team continued to refine what they had learned from the V-2. They redesigned the engine with American materials, improved the turbopumps, and introduced new fuels that burned hotter and longer. The resulting rocket, the PGM-11 Redstone, became the United States' first reliable medium-range ballistic missile, simple, accurate, and built in quantity rather than as a handmade prototype. But for von Braun and many of his colleagues, the Redstone was never the end goal. Their eyes were fixed higher. In 1956, they began working on a modified version of the missile called the Jupiter C, a three-stage test vehicle designed to probe the edge of space. Its first launch, on September 20th, 1956, sent a dummy warhead more than 600 miles downrange and 600 miles high, higher than any American rocket had yet flown. In that moment, the United States quietly entered space. though few outside the program realized it. Then came the shock. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. The beeping signal from that tiny, polished sphere crossed the skies above Washington and Huntsville alike, a taunting reminder that the other side had turned German wartime science into an instrument of prestige and power. The United States, despite years of tests and launches, was officially second. Within weeks, the Army ordered von Braun's group to adapt the Jupiter C into a satellite launcher. On January 31, 1958, their Juno 1 rocket, built on the same lineage as the V-2, lifted off from Cape Canaveral carrying Explorer 1, America's first satellite. When the telemetry confirmed orbit, cheers erupted through the blockhouse. Von Braun turned to his team and said simply, "Now we are equal." The captured V-2 had finally fulfilled its ultimate potential, not as a weapon but as a teacher. Everything the Americans had learned about staging, guidance, and propulsion had begun with that black-and-white rocket examined in the desert a decade earlier. From it came the Redstone that launched Alan Shepard, the first American in space, in 1961, and the Saturn V, whose thunder carried astronauts to the moon only a generation later. In retrospect, US scientists would admit that the V-2's greatest legacy wasn't its technology, but the lesson it delivered. Progress required the full union of science, engineering, and industry. Wartime Germany had achieved that under dictatorship. Post-war America would achieve it under freedom and scale. The American space program, born from captured blueprints, grew far beyond them through mass production, computing, and new materials that outstripped anything the Third Reich could have imagined. Yet the moral weight of that inheritance never disappeared. Many of the engineers who had once served the Nazi state now stood in photographs beside the stars and stripes. Historians would debate whether the ends justified the means, but in the fevered climate of the Cold War, few doubted the necessity. The same knowledge that had built a weapon of terror had also opened the path to the heavens. By the time Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969, the story had come full circle. Reporters visiting Huntsville noted that the engines of the Saturn V still bore the unmistakable lineage of the V-2's design, the same clustered chambers, the same pattern of feed lines refined to perfection. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, one engineer watching the broadcast murmured, "We finally built the rocket we feared." From the underground tunnels of Nordhausen to the launch pads of Florida, the captured German V-2 had carried humanity from war into space. What began as a symbol of tyranny ended as a symbol of possibility. The scientists who first examined its shattered remains in 1945 had been right about one thing: they were years behind. But they caught up, and in doing so, they transformed the legacy of the V-2 into the beginning of the space age.